So I wasn't 100% sure what level to pitch things at, so it's going to be a little bit of a sort of tour of some of the things that we found out through the work that we did for the council. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about sort of the actual modelling and stuff that we did within that project, but I'll just sort of give an example of some of the results. But also sort of doing that work has raised all sorts of other questions about shallow groundwater and how dynamic it is, and not only sort of looking at the steady state sort of rise you might get from sea level rise, but how groundwater levels respond to every single driver that's going through the system. So everything from rainfall through to river flow through to tides, and how all these drivers sort of combine with each other to get some unexpected results sometimes. So I'm quite happy if people want to ask a question as I'm talking, and just make it quite informal and do it that way, or if everyone just wants to sit and listen, I'll take questions at the end. So obviously climate change is an area of increasing concern for many people, and a lot of the concern is around things like coastal erosion, sea level inundation, and extreme events. And there's various councils throughout the country that are grappling with the implications, but what I'm going to talk about often gets forgotten about. So, as I said, groundwater is out of sight, out of mind, and often overlooked. The thing about groundwater is it varies. It varies in space, it varies with depth, and it varies with time. So it's a four-dimensional sort of problem that we've got here. And added to that, you can't see it. Changes can occur relatively slowly, and when you get groundwater levels rising, often it can be because of things that have happened for several years. At the moment, deep groundwater levels are actually very low because we've had 2 or 3 dry winters when you don't get recharge. So you often get this year-on-year effect. We don't see that so much with shallow groundwater. That seems to be more of a short-term effect, but some of the information I'll show you actually does. You can start to see that interannual effect. This is a photo. It's actually from close to where I used to live in the UK, but this lane here was flooded for months as a result of groundwater. So basically it was that year-on-year effect. We got high groundwater levels, and once they got up there, they weren't going anywhere. So this access into the village in this area was actually shut off for months because of it. So just a little background about what's under Christchurch. Basically, sometimes people don't understand sort of how groundwater systems work, so I sort of thought I'd put this in just for a bit of introduction. If you imagine this is Christchurch is in this sort of area, so right over that side, over to the west, you've got the Alps and the plains, and you get recharge landing or water landing on the Alps, running down the rivers, landing on the plains and seeping into the ground. And so this is the end of a very long flow system. So the water that falls over here works its way down through the aquifer system, and then by the time it gets to these aquifers at the coast, it's actually under a lot of pressure. It's complicated here because over geological timescales, the coast has moved in and out as water's been locked up in the ice during the glacial periods, and then it's melted during the interglacials. So what you tend to get is things like that. You've got the Riccarton gravels, various other gravels, and they will lay down in those glacial periods by that sort of braided river system that we still see today. So everything that's under our feet, well, most of what's under our feet has been laid down by the sort of braided river systems that we see today. And they've built up the plains to about 400 or 500 metres thickness, so considerable thickness. But then what happened is when the coastline moved in, due to interglacial periods and all the ice melting, you get marine conditions sort of over this area. So then you get these very fine grained sediments, so sands and silts and clays being laid down. So you end up with this quite complicated multi-layer system with interlayered gravels and then silts and sands and then more gravels. So what actually happens is you get very high pressures in some of these lower gravels that are being fed from way at the plains. So if you put a bore down at Brighton, you could get water coming up 10 metres above the ground because it's under such Artesian pressure. So that's all underlying what we've actually got at the surface. And there is some link between certainly the Riccarton gravels and what we see in the very shallow groundwater. It's not directly linked, but you can see those pressure effects coming through into the shallow groundwater. And this is just giving an example of some of the sediments. So you've got really clean gravels there. We call those open framework gravels. It's where most of the water flow occurs. But then within a few metres, you get into this sort of silty, sandy material. So it can be quite variable quite rapidly. So just sort of keeping it fairly general at the moment, what does climate change mean for groundwater? First of all, there might be less recharge, certainly over in the eastern side of South Island. A lot of the predictions are that it's going to be warmer, it's going to be drier, so there's less water actually going into the ground. We're likely to get more extreme events. This could cause more recharge because certainly in the event we had 2 weekends ago, the rain was so intense, so not all of it went into the ground, but a considerable amount actually went into the ground. So when you get those sort of extreme events, even if you've got what's called a soil moisture deficit and the plants are growing and everything else, and you wouldn't normally get recharge, under those sort of conditions you can still get recharge. If you get more rapid recharge, you can also have some water quality issues because you can get E. coli and other things being carried down from the surface into the groundwater. On the other hand, if we get less recharge, then we might have some problems with droughts and inability to actually get the water out of the ground that we need. And then on top of all of those sort of things that could happen around climate change, there's sea level rise. And one of the interesting things about groundwater is the effects that we'll see from sea level rise on groundwater go a lot further inland than just coastal inundation effects. So in terms of urban shallow groundwater, when is there actually a problem? It's a really interesting question, and if you ask different people, you get different answers. But basically, if groundwater daylights, it can contribute to surface flooding. And I think one of the saving graces from that recharge event that rainfall event a couple of weekends ago, was actually groundwater levels were already low. So if groundwater levels had been high and you'd added that rainfall to that, then we'd have seen a lot worse flooding in some areas. It can be a problem with wastewater infiltration and stormwater infiltration. That's one of the pipes under Christchurch. There's an awful lot of groundwater going into those. If it comes up into the shallow subsurface of the road and you get vehicles driving over that, then the pressure effects actually deteriorate road surfaces really quickly. It's not unusual that people come across groundwater, at least when they're expecting it, and they're doing horizontal infrastructure works, they're laying pipes or whatever, and or even building construction, you suddenly come across groundwater when you're not expecting it. It contributes obviously to liquefaction hazard. It can affect how we design buildings and foundations. It can cause issues with damp and health, and one of the sort of more unexpected things that I came across doing this work was sometimes it's actually a pain in the neck when you're trying to decide what plants to put in a certain area, and one of the issues was with a retention basin that the council were putting in, and they'd actually planned the trees that were going to plant there based on what they expected as a depth to groundwater. And then I got a panic-stricken phone call saying, it's a lot shallower than we expected and these trees won't survive, so have we got to go and get some different ones? So it's unexpected things like that come along. So the question is how some of these might change with climate change. And will we actually get to the point that there'll be areas where the infrastructure fails, where the stormwater system or the sewers can no longer function as they should, and ultimately will areas be unlivable? So in order to understand shallow groundwater, in order to manage it properly, you need to understand shallow groundwater. So on the left there is a typical sort of cross-section through an aquifer system. You get rainfall occurring, you get evaporation going on, you get some recharge when you've got more rainfall than evaporation, and the water comes down into the aquifer, flows along these lovely straight flow lines and into a stream here. And that's sort of the typical conceptual model. But when you come into an urban area, you've got all these other things going on. So injection, there's a lot of ground source heat pump systems in the city at the moment, putting water back into the ground, and that tends to be into that upper Rickerton gravel there. You can have pipes losing water, you can have drains losing water, got all the usual rainfall, evapotranspiration, recharge and runoff things going on. Subsurface infrastructure can affect groundwater drainage, and obviously there's things like abstraction as well and infiltration into sewers, and all of that sort of works together to affect how the system works. In terms of what do we know about urban shallow groundwater, there's not an awful lot known. In Christchurch, we're actually really, really lucky. I'll talk about the network we've got in a minute, but we've probably got one of the best networks in the world in terms of monitoring shallow groundwater. But what do we know? We know it's hugely variable. We know that surface water, groundwater, and coast are all linked. We also know that short records aren't very useful, and also that low temporal resolution data doesn't tell us everything. And what I mean by that is this particular shallow well here was being monitored once a month. So we went along with the dipper and dipped it and just got a water level once a month. And then installed a pressure transducer which measures water levels at 15-minute intervals. And then we downloaded the data, and it's like, what on earth is going on here? But actually every one of those spikes is a response to a rainfall event. So sort of when I sort of often say, I think the thing that tells us is that the technician didn't like going out in the rain because he didn't measure any high groundwater levels. And antecedent conditions can be really important. So again, what I mean there is, in this one, where you've got the groundwater levels responding to rainfall recharge in the winter, every time you get a rainfall event, then in the winter, the groundwater levels go back up to the surface. But if you're in the summer period, when you're not getting a lot of recharge, levels are going down, you don't get a response to the rainfall event. So depending on the particular area you're in and how the groundwater responds, sometimes those existing conditions when you get a rainfall event are really, really important. So groundwater will respond to, three primary drivers. So that's climate, that's rainfall recharge, it responds to river flow, and it'll respond to tides. And that's just a bit of an overview. I'll talk about each of those in a minute. But that's just for the responses that we see around Christchurch, and they're all quite different. You also get responses to all sorts of other things, including earthquakes, urban infrastructure. In this case, the graph there shows you this lovely, I looked at this and said, they've been pumping water and that's a recovery. And then that's a drawdown response. And that recovery we see was just before Christmas, and the drawdown was just after New Year. And they were dewatering an area for putting in some pipes. And we saw this response going on around the whole area. So they switched off the pumps for Christmas, got a recovery, and then switched them back on again and got that lovely drawdown. But in actual fact, when you look at that record in the long term, it's the natural groundwater levels are a good 1.5 meters above what they were over that period. So it just sort of highlights the variability and how you've got to take everything in context when you're trying to understand shallow groundwater. You can have a problem with repairing infrastructure because the council doesn't like having lots of water going into the sewers, because then it's got to go to Bromley and get treated. They are trying to repair sewers and put in pressure sewer systems, but you've got to be a bit careful around that, because if you shut off groundwater's exit from the ground, then you can get groundwater levels rising. So that's quite a sort of unintended consequences can occur if you're not really looking out for it. They also respond, I mentioned ground source heat pumps. There's a lot of systems going in, particularly in the city centre. And they inject into the ricks and gravels, but that causes a pressure response that just drives shallow groundwater levels up a little bit. Some areas are fine, some areas have a little bit more of a response. And of course, we'll also get a response to climate change and sea level rise. So when we're trying to understand what's happening with groundwater, we've got all of these things that are interacting and sometimes adding and sometimes offsetting each other. So I talked about the network we have. Post-earthquake, EQC put in over 1,000 shallow holes, and that's the distribution of them on the left there. So you might actually see them around Christchurch. It's got these little circular lids, and underneath that there's a water level monitoring point. So after they started in 2011 putting these holes in, and by 2017 they decided it was actually a bit silly keeping on sending someone out once a month to go around and get a water level from all of these. So they rationalised it down to the network on the right there and put pressure transducers in. And these pressure transducers are the little devices that basically measure water levels every 15 minutes. Well, they were set to measure it every 15 minutes. So yeah, we started off with over 1,000 holes, dropped down to 250. There was a slight overlap in terms of actually going around and getting water levels manually, and then stopped dipping the rest of the network in 2017. And then that network's now been taken over by the City Council. And what they are going to be doing is actually looking at the distribution, because the distribution was originally put in for land damage assessments. So that network was originally focused on those areas that were affected by land damage during the earthquakes. And we really need to think about where they're all located and instrument some different areas now. Yeah, so once we got this data, when I first got that data that's on the right-hand side of the top graph, I looked at it and thought, there's something wrong with the instrument. This is just not what we're expecting. We'd never really looked at shallow groundwater under the city and the dynamics of the response. And then I sort of matched it up with rainfall events, like I said, and it's just like, no, that actually is a genuine response to rainfall. So once we started looking at this data, it was like, this is an eye-opener really in terms of what's going on under the city. The response is highly dynamic, and as I said, short-term data really aren't a lot of use. But we spent quite a bit of time in 2017 looking at this first year's data. And as you can see, that sort of year-on-year response that I talked about, we certainly see that happening in some parts of the city. So, as I said, that ends in about November, I think, last year. Groundwater levels continue to go down, really, until that rainfall event we saw 2 weekends ago. So, just run through a few examples just to explain what I sort of see in this data. So this is what I'd call a typical groundwater response. You see a recovery in the winter and then a recession in the summer. High groundwater levels can be sustained for 1 to 2 months at times, depending on what the rainfall recharge is. And as I said, there's been declining groundwater levels through recent years. This one is a little bit of an oddity in some ways. It is a really flashy response. It responds to every rainfall event that's occurring. But you can see underlying that sort of base flow that you see at the bottom, that is showing more of a groundwater response. It's just you've got that and then you've got very flashy response on top of that. The advantage with somewhere like this is if it rains, groundwater levels will shoot up to the surface, but they'll be back down again before you realise that it ever paid you a visit. So much more similar to stream flow. In this case, a lot of the ones that are responding like this are actually close to streams, so it does seem like they're well connected to the stream. As the stream goes up, the groundwater goes up. In this case, it's not actually near a stream, and I'm suspicious this is related to a soakaway that's located nearby, so all the water gets diverted down the soakaway, groundwater levels shoot up, but they come back down again quickly. That one's just a bit of an in-between, bit of a flashy response, but also that longer-term groundwater response. And then we've got a couple that are close to the coast. I was actually quite surprised at how much the one in orange is, I think it's about 13 metres from the coast. I was quite surprised how close that was to the coast and how much you still see a sort of response to recharge events in the signal. So if you get a big recharge event here, then what happens is that groundwater levels can be going up to the surface and back down again on a twice daily basis. And there's some evidence that water is quite saline as well at times, so that then causes all sorts of issues with infrastructure and vegetation and things like that. The other one is about 170 metres inland of the orange one, and that shows much less of a tidal response and more of that long-term recharge response. I just wanted to show this video because it's quite fun to watch. This is showing ex-tropical cyclones Debbie and Cook as they moved across Christchurch in 2017. Basically, it's a video that a guy called John Haynes from GNS managed to pull together. So it's taking every 15-minute data point at every piezometer around the city and interpolating a surface and then building all those surfaces to make a movie, which is quite clever. So it's a good illustration of the way that groundwater levels change in response to rainfall events. Don't try and read too much into the levels. Basically, if it's going blue, it's getting wetter, and if it's going red, it's getting drier. But it's just interesting to see the way that different areas respond. Some go up and come back down. Some go up and stay up, and they go up a bit more. So the first one, ex-tropical cyclone Debbie came through on 5th to 6th of April, and then Cook came through on the 14th to 15th of April. Just got to work out how to show it. Right, there you go. And you can see that it's almost like it breathing, because that's the data points along the rivers that are responding on a twice daily basis. So that was the first cyclone moving across. And then lots of areas are starting to go back down again and starting to go back to average or below average conditions.
And we put the city, you can see the loop and the Avon there?
Yeah.
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 So the city's not
It's
that well positioned.
no.
It seems a bit like
Yeah. I mean,
well,
it's
they knew that
yeah.
when they built it.
I mean, the thing is, this is entirely dependent on the data points you've got. So where we haven't got data points, you sort of get an interpolation between 2 points that are quite far away. So this is part of the reason we need to fill in some of the gaps. But yeah, the effects of the rainfall, those rainfall events, do seem to propagate up the rivers quite well.
Yeah, so it seems that the variance along the rivers is really strong.
Yeah, and actually one of that was something else. I've been talking a lot about the dynamic responses, but the work we did with the council, we did look at all this, but we focused much more on that sort of steady state. How much does the sort of average groundwater level rise up in response to sea level rise? But what we found was the rivers are really important. If you don't get the rivers right, then you're going to be out in terms of the response of the groundwater, because the backwater effects go at the river, that affects the groundwater levels. So the rivers are really, really important.
Could you explain how?
It's the backwater effects and tidal effects as they go up the river, really. And also, I guess in those cyclones, again, it was like a couple of weeks ago, there's huge amounts of water moving down the rivers. And so the river stage rises up, and it brings the groundwater levels up as well.
It's a flood effect.
Yeah. You can't pull apart whether the river's driving the groundwater levels are driving the rivers sometimes, but they're interlinked. So yeah. But in this case, in response to those extratropical cyclones, I'd have said that it was probably the rivers were taking a whole load of flow that was raising the river stage, and then groundwater near them was rising as well. Yeah.
It seems the estuary was fairly dry all the way through.
I think it's just a lack of data points around there that's the big issue, and that's why I sort of say this is a lovely illustration of how variable the responses are across the city, but wouldn't read too much into areas where there's not much to be able to.
There's not much data points
No.
in the Waimea River either, is there?
No, not at all. No.
And that would be huge.
Yeah.
So there are plans to add more, are there?
Well, the majority of the original holes in the ground are still there. All the original, there were about 700 left in, I think, by the time construction works had sort of removed 1 or 2 from the ground and stuff like that. But no one actually deliberately went and filled them in. So the council have still got opportunity to take some of these transducers and go and drop them down different ones. Yeah, so that's a conversation we're having with the council at the moment. Yeah.
Because I do see from your report that like when they took the Sumner one, there weren't that many in the area, only one
No.
up the valley.
Yeah.
So that really makes it difficult to give clear information. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I mean, the Sumner area was difficult to model because of the lack of data. And it is an area that's of concern to the council, so they're doing some more monitoring there now. Sumner was very strongly controlled by a surface water drain coming down one side of the valley. Yeah.
There's the one drain, and there's another stream. Is
Yeah.
there 2 streams?
Yeah.
The box drain.
Yeah.
Heaven forbid.
Yeah.
I noticed that the data was difficult to actually display because there wasn't any.
Mm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'll get rid of that. So, I mean, I've talked a bit about sort of all the data that we've been looking at, but when is it a problem? This is an issue that we actually spent an awful long time talking to people about. Everybody had a different opinion about shallow groundwater and when it was a problem. The roading guys just said, "Oh, we don't care where it is. We just know we have to go out and repair the roads on a regular basis." And it's like, subdivision people were concerned about shallow groundwater for a different reason. I'll come on to why the council really are interested in it, because there were so many things that it needs to be taken into account for. So even down to land use planning, you don't actually want to be going and allowing a subdivision where you're going to have issues with shallow groundwater, because it's going to affect so many things down the road.
But you said it's linked to the liquefaction, so the high, so that,
If you're in
we
liquefaction,
kind of sorted that a little bit with the red zone.
yes, yeah, to a certain degree, yeah, yeah. But I mean, again, the variability of it was an eye-opener, and if we got an earthquake at a time when there was really high groundwater levels in certain areas, then you might see an entirely different.
That would have been really interesting.
Yeah.
He could have called that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's going to be different with every earthquake, and you're never going to be able to predict it. One of the things I would really like to see the council developing would be a telemetry network, and we're talking about this as well, but key areas being telemetry, so you've got real-time data, so that when you see a storm moving in, you can actually incorporate what groundwater is doing in terms of where you might expect to need to send the pumps and deal with flooding.
Right,
So,
sure.
but that's the next stage. So in terms of the work we did for the council and sort of the more general side of the report, basically we obtained all this data across the city, and we couldn't, when we actually did this work, we couldn't use that high resolution data, the 15-minute data, because we actually didn't have it at the time. It still wasn't available. So what we did was take the longer term data from the water level dips that have been done and use that as our to create a baseline, basically. So we summarised all that data. I sent it off to a bunch of people who are very good at looking at geostatistics, because that's an area that I certainly don't know anything about, and they looked at the distribution of the data and created what we called the baseline surface. We eventually got agreement on what was a problematic depth to groundwater, and we went for this 85th centile of 0.35 metres. So basically, the 85th centile is set at a level that is only exceeded 15% of the time. So that was your sort of absolute level that we said that's going to be how we set our baseline. And then we were looking really for areas where that was exceeded, but when 0.35 was exceeded by that 85th centile level. I hope that sort of makes sense. When we started on the project, we thought someone will have looked at this, someone will have come up with what is a problematic depth to groundwater. We actually found that if you looked worldwide at the literature, no one wanted to define it. So the only place we could find any information was actually the Netherlands. And obviously they've got a big problem with groundwater. And even there it was a case of they used 0.7 of a metre, but it was like, well, when would you actually go in and do something about groundwater being at 0.7 of a metre below? And how often has it got to be at 0.7 of a metre, given it goes up and down? Is that an average or what? And we couldn't actually find those details. And it just seemed to be a case of somehow if someone thought that they had a problem with shallow groundwater and it was roughly 0.7 of a metre down sometimes, then the council would come along and have a look and think about how they were going to deal with it. But it was really, really, really vague. So we had various discussions. Like I said, we talked to roading guys, subdivision people, drainage, water supply people. We talked to everyone we could across the council and sort of basically sat down in a room with them and just sort of said, what's going to be acceptable? And it was a gradual process of consensus. If we'd made it somewhere like 0.7 of a metre, I think we'd have found we'd suddenly map out huge red areas of Christchurch that are actually coping okay at the moment. But sort of 0.35 was just a bit of a compromise, really, between all these different competing interests and the work that was done in the Netherlands. But like I said, there doesn't seem to be anything published worldwide on what's acceptable. It just seems like everywhere deals with it a bit differently. So, that was it, that wasn't us saying, well, we're going to go for 0.35 and the 80th percentile. That was like it went through everyone we could talk to at council trying to find out what was. And that's when we had the conversation with the roading guys, and they go, well, we don't care, we just repair the roads.
Can I ask a question? If a developer or a roadie puts a metre of fill on top of the
Yeah.
end, does that affect the level of the groundwater?
Not on a
So it would
small.
stay the same?
It'll say, and yeah, we actually looked at some groundwater level data post-earthquake where the land had subsided, and generally it stays roughly in the same position.
Relative to the surface?
Yeah. So, I mean, groundwater is, that water table is connected with every other area. So in the across the road, say, where if you raise that up a metre, you've still got the groundwater on either side of the road that's still, it hasn't changed, nothing has changed. We always say on a large scale, the water table is a subdued reflection of topography. So under a hill, you'll tend to have a mound in groundwater, but that's on quite a large scale. So you don't tend to see these really small scale features. So what we did was taking all that into account, we created this baseline surface, and then we used a numerical groundwater model, and this had already been created by a colleague of mine, Julian. But what he did was he spent a lot of time refining it for the city. So the important things to really take into account were the rivers, and trying to make sure we got the backwater effects right coming at the rivers when you added however many centimetres at the coast. And the other important thing to take into account was the drain, because Christchurch is obviously crisscrossed with drains everywhere. If we didn't take those into account, then you'd get areas that did appear to be flooded, because actually the drains are doing a pretty good job of keeping groundwater levels down. So change the boundary conditions in the model, and what that means is basically along the coastline, we just increase the level of the sea. It's not as simple as that. There's quite a few things to take into account, but basically if you increase the level of the sea level at the coast, then those effects will propagate in through the model. And there was, what we did, instead of taking the absolute levels in the model, which can be quite coarse, we said what's the change between current groundwater and groundwater if we add a 0.19 metre sea level rise or 0.4 metre sea level rise. And then we added those changes to the original baseline surface. So in that way you try to minimise the errors that you might get through the modelling approach. And then what we did was mapped depth to groundwater across the city. And I guess what really came out is, first of all, there's some areas without data which we've got very, very little confidence in. Those areas tended to stick out like a sore thumb right from the start, irrespective of whether there's sea level rise or not, because there was no data there to really control them. But other than that, you did start to see a marginal increasing effect as you sort of put more and more sea level rise in. But as I said, I mean, areas like this area up here, they always, even under sort of the minimum sea level rise conditions, it's just, they did tend to appear to be an issue, but it was more to do with the lack of data than anything else. It's a limitation of whatever we do with this. So yeah, the results were basically we determined the inland extent of sea level rise on groundwater levels, and as far as possible included the effects of drains and rivers, and that's the some of the modelling that you were mentioning earlier.
So the red lines are drains?
These are contours basically. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, that's obviously a 0.4 metre sea level rise scenario, because you've got 0.4 of a metre rise along the coast. So these are contours of groundwater level rise. And the effects are really, like I said, a lot of it's been controlled by this drain on this side. In terms of issues and uncertainties, what the people doing the geostatistical analysis said basically was that there was so much difference between one location and another. It was actually really, really difficult to do a good geostatistical job in terms of producing that baseline. And we know that is an issue. On top of that, you've got all the effects of rivers and drains, which in a model we can try to include those, but we never, as I say, no model's right, but some are useful. So we do our best to include those, and we hope we've got them in the right ballpark, but there's always an unknown there. And the other big effect that we can't really incorporate in a groundwater model is the urban infrastructure and what that is doing, apart from the fact that the measured groundwater levels should reflect the local infrastructure. So if sewers are taking away a whole load of groundwater, then that should be reflected in the groundwater levels that we're monitoring. So that should then be reflected in that baseline surface. But these are all slightly unknowns. So I sort of started writing that, and then I thought, well, actually, how helpful is it? I think it indicates areas of concern, and then that indicates areas that we can start to think of needs more investigation in terms of looking at the impacts of sea level rise. So it can lead to more focused investigations, and that would always been the point of this project. It was never meant to be identifying properties, individual properties who might have an issue. It was about saying, look, there looks to be an issue there, we need to go and do some more work. So I sort of talked a bit about the specifics of the project, but this is sort of really just going, thinking about things a little bit more generically. Obviously, increased extreme events and sea level rise are going to add to the shallow groundwater responses, and it's not only Christchurch that's got an issue. There's many cities around New Zealand that are going to have an issue. And like I said, Christchurch is actually in a really strong position. We've got this really good network, and the council have taken it fairly seriously, really, in terms of including groundwater. There's too many councils that I talk to, and they say, oh, I've got more important things to think about with climate change. I mean, the stop banks need building up or whatever. And it's like, well, groundwater in some areas is going to cause a bigger issue than anything else. So this is sort of a more general message. In order to manage the impacts and build resilience, we need to understand the risk. We're doing a really good job at monitoring. We've done some modelling, but we haven't even started to really understand that dynamic response on top of the steady state response. And I think that's got to be something we need to start thinking about. We can investigate mitigation. There has been a little bit of work done around that in Christchurch, just sort of looking at what options there are. And then if we've got all this sort of all sorted, then we can enable much better decision making. So some of the issues around monitoring, as I said, there's a little bit of a biased data distribution in terms of where we've got water level data. Again, one of the things I tend to talk to councils about is you can never have enough monitoring. If you had enough monitoring, you'd have a Swiss cheese sort of thing with holes everywhere. But you can never have enough, and you can never afford that sort of density. So you really need to think about focusing on why we're monitoring. Are there particular areas we need to focus on really understanding better? What we can do is, if we've got some data, even short-term data, we can fill in the gaps often. We can do correlations with other wells that have got long-term record, and we can start to fill in the gaps. And that graph at the bottom is just an example of what we did was create what we call a master hydrograph with a long-term set of long-term wells. And then for every month of every year, we could say, well, the water level that month was high or very high or average. And then if we get another well that you've only got one water level measurement for, then you can say, oh, well, yeah, but that's from that month, that year, so we know that groundwater levels were high or low or whatever. So that's just one illustration of a way of making a whole load more use of some of this sort of one-off data.
Is there any consideration of increasing the monitoring in the coastal area? It seems to be a little sparse.
Yeah.
In terms of data collection along the coastline, virtually from the Waimak, certainly from the Waimak down.
Yep.
And even around New Brighton, South Brighton, there seems to be quite a void in data collection. I'm having conversations with the council because they see the need to actually rationalise the network, move things about and start picking up some extra data points. But I imagine that's going to be one of the areas that they would like to get some more information.
Maybe even in the city we have had problems with these springs, like under the Metro Sports Centre. The groundwater apparently was quite here.
Yeah.
Is there monitoring around that area?
So far they've done nothing with. I don't think there is any. I'm trying to. I didn't think there was any specifically around the Metro Sports Centre. The council haven't got anywhere yet in terms of sorting out where they want the monitoring, and it's something that I think is becoming increasingly urgent, because
Yes.
we do need to get a better spread across the city. So the issue at the Metro was when they started trying to do ground source heat pump investigations and started injecting into the Rickerton gravels. And in that particular area, I think there wasn't very much mounding, but the overlying layers were really not very competent. And
There was bad liquefaction all around it.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the fact there's been liquefaction means there'll be some discontinuities in the ground, and that they get exploited if you start. Yeah. But that it actually really raises the issue of the short-term data. There's too often that that people will go to a site and do a few measurements and say, right, that's where groundwater is, and you can see from some of the data, a few measurements, even over a few months, means nothing. But there's too many people, and that's another project that we're trying to push with MB, just getting some guidelines out there about if you want to understand groundwater, this is what you need to do, and have some guidelines about doing groundwater monitoring, so that we don't end up with some of the mistakes that have been made in Christchurch in terms of not understanding where groundwater is. It's quite an important issue, yeah.
How far does the data go back?
We've got about 50 long-term wells that are owned by the City Council and ECAN, and they go back 20 or 30 years, but they're just once-a-month measurements. The EQC data they started collecting from 2011 to 2016, and then they put those transducers down in 2017, so that high resolution data is only from 2017 to now. So
There's some letters, I did a bunch of research on this, and there's a letter from the head of water, the Christchurch Water Board from 1865, when they were trying to dig a sewage line in Okawa, Waltham.
yeah,
And he writes in this letter to his superior, look, we can't do it, because it was winter,
yeah,
and they dig, and the water just was coming,
Yeah.
so they couldn't actually
Yeah.
put what they needed to put down, which was
Yeah.
only, 30 centimeters.
it's
1865, because we know we're on a swamp.
yeah, it's ironic because
We
people
know.
people seem to have forgotten that in the meantime.
Just look at the old map.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And
they would
what's-
have known that about the sports centre too.
Yeah.
They would have known.
And when they used to be laying horizontal infrastructure sewers, they would often put a groundwater drain alongside them so that they didn't have the water that infiltrating into the sewer. So
Yeah.
again, that's got forgotten about. So yeah, I
Are they
think
very effective, those groundwater drains?
I don't know. I don't know if any exist still. I know the sewers are very effective at getting rid of groundwater though.
Especially our broken ones.
A third of the water that arrives at Bromley is groundwater. So it's a huge amount of water. And talking to people at council, there are sewers that run full 24/7, even when no one's up in the middle of the night flushing the toilet or anything. That there's that much groundwater going into them. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's
Is there any way of understanding the effects of new subdivisions on the older areas of Christchurch with groundwater, the modern way of dispersing stormwater in
So-
a new suburb.
things like sustainable urban drainage.
Yeah, like they use
Stormwater
different
management.
methods now to deal
Yeah.
with stormwater than they used to. So does more of that end up in
It could do if
running
it.
off into the older areas, if you know what I mean? Or
I'm hoping that every time they do a subdivision, they actually look at all of that side of things. I know an ex-colleague of mine was involved in that sort of investigation, trying to work out impacts of the subdivision on groundwater and knock-on effects. Yeah, so I'd assume that's fairly standard. Yeah, but yeah, it is. There are so many things going on. I mean, there's things like sustainable urban drainage, where you make the surfaces actually semi-permeable rather than impermeable. There's a sort of a push at times to take roof water and let it infiltrate into the ground and things like that. And all of these are going to be affecting groundwater levels.
Is there a preference for that, like, for example, moving towards more of those kind of things like sumps in areas where they've got high drainage like sand? Or is there a preference for them to go into stormwater?
I'm not actually sure across the city as a whole. I don't know.
I just mean from a water management point of view, from a scientific point of view. Is it better for it to go into a sump, a natural sump type arrangement, or is it seen as better to be taken away through the pipe system?
If I mean, if you've got a reasonable depth of water and you've got free draining subsoil or sediments, then a sump would probably be a good idea. But unfortunately, across a lot of Christchurch, we don't really have the luxury of being able to add to the groundwater.
Most places do harvesting. They do rebates if you have a tank and you keep your rainwater.
Yeah.
Especially if they're going to charge you for water. And then you can water your
You
garden.
water your garden,
Because
yeah.
it never rains in Christchurch except for in the winter.
Simon's got a question.
Oh, sorry.
I think
Sorry.
we've ambushed you. I don't know how many slides you've got to go, but it's,
Are we running out of time? Oh.
No, then you've got.
Oh, no, I've only probably got 5.
We actually sort of encourage a bit of a conversation.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
So we'll just carry on.
Yeah.
with it.
Really fascinating, that last part, your question. One of the adaptation strategies which is interesting for cities is so-called sponge cities, where you actually stop the drainage and actually allow the water table to find its place under new conditions. Now, given what the old conditions were, the east being a bog, that's interesting for Christchurch. I think.
Yeah. I think Christchurch has got enough problems without trying to add to to the infiltration in a lot of areas. In some areas you'd be okay, but in a lot of areas you actually don't want to be adding to the infiltration, if anything.
The question from over here is that this natural drainage is possibly problematic, isn't it?
It could be, yeah, and
Well, I know the Styx catchment, for example, has suffered somewhat as suburban development is exacerbated in the upper reaches of the catchment. The water flow
in the river, yeah.
The water flow in the river itself is pretty much at maximum, and so you only have to have an extreme weather event
and you're underwater. Yeah. I mean, the Styx River itself wasn't helped by the earthquakes because you got lateral spread and bed heave and everything else, so the actual cross-section of the river reduced. So that's partly why in parts of it that it's such a high level. But yeah, then if you've got a whole load of extra runoff coming from upgradient where you've created some impermeable surfaces and that's getting into the river, then that will add to the problem, yeah.
So I have a question. So you showed earlier on these aquifers, obviously they'll go down these sort of tunnels and out to the sea eventually. Now with shallow groundwater, I'm guessing it's getting out to sea via rivers, is it?
Yes, generally. I mean, the main rivers in Christchurch are spring-fed. So on the western side of the city, you've got springs in there. On the western side of the city, it's where these confining layers pinch out. So groundwater that's relatively shallow will just come up into a spring, and then that sort of feeds the Avon and the Heathcote and areas like that. Yeah. So a lot of the shallow groundwater will find its way into a waterway. Yeah.
So if you build 30,000 houses in Horswall, where will the water go? Into the Heathcote River?
Probably ultimately. They've been putting a whole load of flood management up at the top end of the catchment. Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes the council is stuck a little bit between a rock and a hard place, but yeah, it can add. So it can certainly add to surface water flows, and that's then I guess because he connected with groundwater as well, then you can get a knock-on effect in terms of groundwater. So one of the things I just put this in because this is something that wasn't within the project, but it was a bit of fun. The graph on the figure on the right there is I took the wastewater network and the baseline surface and intersected those two to try and work out where the areas of the city are that actually the council might be concerned about the wastewater network. And obviously the red areas are areas where our predicted surface and overlaying with the depth to the sewer suggests that they've got particular issues. And it was useful in some areas, I think, to help them understand that actually that's an area that is likely to have the sewers underwater a lot of the time. And the other work there actually is some work that was done in the UK, and they came up with these flood risk maps for the whole of the UK in terms of shallow groundwater, so that they actually created a national data set showing what areas that are likely to be impacted by shallow groundwater.
So this is now, or is this after a certain sea level rise?
No, the work that they did in the UK was probably 10 years ago, so that they weren't seriously thinking about sea level rise at the time.
But I mean, this
Yeah, and the one on the right, that was our baseline surface, so that's our existing surface, yeah. So that sort of thing could be really useful in terms of looking at areas that using the different depths to water under different sea level rise scenarios. You could do the same intersection and look at the areas that are going to be impacted first from sea level rise, and maybe they're the areas you want to be thinking about how we're going to deal with this.
Is that shared? Have you shared that map? I mean,
no, this was
yours.
just, it was just a bit of work. It was just
Right.
playing with the data really to see what it showed.
Because that's quite a useful.
Yeah,
It's interesting how it's really distributed right across the city, isn't it?
yeah. Because the depth of water is in a way a little bit more constant, but the sewers are up and down and all over the place. So it sort of gives you a different view on what might be happening. So in terms of mitigation options, part of the project originally was to look at mitigation options, but then it changed focus a little bit. But we did have a look at options along with Becca. And when you're actually thinking about groundwater, there aren't that many options. There's drains, which we're already doing. You can put in subsoil drains, so they're just effectively drains that are buried. You can put in dewatering wells, but if you start to dewater large areas of groundwater, then it's high cost, it's high maintenance, and if you're near the coast, then basically you end up just recirculating the water. So you're pumping it out, putting it out to sea, and the sea's coming back in, so it's not a long-term solution. We also had a quick look at the opportunity for things like cut-off walls, which have been used in some areas. But the ultimate option, I guess, for some areas is going to be managed retreat, because there will be some areas that sea level rise is just going to have an impact that isn't manageable. So yeah, the issues there are that often it's costs, either capital or operational, the fact that things need maintenance and they've got a fixed life.
Clarify, you said that mitigation options were part of your original brief and
Yeah.
then it sort of disappeared. Do you know why that was?
There was a panel of experts who basically reviewed a lot of work that the council were doing at the time, and that
Independent experts?
yes,
or
yeah,
council?
no, independent experts. So they were looking at various different projects that were going on within council, and include all the ones around flooding and land drainage. And they were pushing for it. They said this is more of a hazard mapping exercise or a hazard assessment exercise, rather than let's fix it. So the sort of focus became more about understanding the hazard. And then when we've brought together all the different projects and understand the overall hazard and all the cascading effects of groundwater and surface water and everything else, then at that point we need to understand what the
mitigation
options are. So that's still something that will happen, but it's
so it's additional work
yeah.
that might still come online?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Just looking at your image there, did any part of your early work look at changes in saltwater intrusion?
We didn't look at it in any detail, no. We did realise it could be an impact around the coastline. And I've talked to a couple of people who are sort of fairly knowledgeable about saline intrusion as part of this, trying to understand what the risks were. And they couldn't give me a hard and fast answer. It's a bit complicated because, especially on the Brighton Spit, you've actually got seawater on two sides, and you've got this artesian system with upwards pressure. So it's actually quite a complex system compared to something like that, which is straightforward. The overall view I got back really was that with the system that we've got, saline intrusion wasn't likely to be a major issue, but we do see some evidence in the very shallow layers where you're getting the sort of response to the tide. You are getting some movement of saline water into that upper layer. So.
The cut-off walls, what's an example of that, or how would that look, a cut-off wall?
The example I found was actually wasn't a brick-built wall. They were talking about sheet metal, but you're limited as to how deep you can go with it, and there's some evidence that you might get things going on underneath it. So it's not a simple solution, and it wouldn't be cheap.
Nice theoretical solution, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
I think Gary Tier's talked about those a little bit, so it'll be interesting to hear what he's got to say.
Yeah.
He's talked about semi-permeable membranes.
Right.
So
Okay.
I think there's definitely a conversation to be had and
Yeah.
a worthwhile research area.
Yeah. But I think mitigation's one option, but I also think we really need to be focused now on avoiding the problem in the first place. So this was, some work I did actually for Napier Council, but one of the things was what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve and where do they fit into the four well-beings. But there's all these things. Better land use decisions is really important. So let's not go and zone land for residential. If we know there's going to be a problem with shallow groundwater and you're going to have all the consequent effects on roading and assets and everything else. What else is there? More efficient asset management planning. Again, if you're understanding what shallow groundwater is doing, then you can be better at managing your assets. You can obviously be the council can obviously be much better at operational flood management, again, if they understand shallow groundwater and how that impacts on surface water flooding. Optimising construction work is one, I think, was it you? So you mentioned with laying the sewers and they came across shallow groundwater in the middle of winter. I mean, it's a fairly obvious one, but people had never really thought about this. So again, if you're in one of those areas where you've got that long-term type hydrograph, go and do your work in the middle of summer because you're going to have far less dewatering to deal with. And if you're in a flashy area, it really doesn't matter when you're going to do it. If it rains, you're going to get water in your trenches. But, so there's lots of sort of different areas which could impact mainly on the economic sort of well-beings for councils. So getting towards the end. So basically, I think the key message is groundwater is out of sight and out of mind a lot of the time, and it's frustrating for me being a groundwater hydrologist that I get that repeated message from different councils. Oh no, we've got more important things to be worrying about. But the effects can be long-lasting, and the effects can propagate a long way inland from the coast. But on top of that, you've also got to remember that this shallow groundwater is really highly dynamic, and it does respond to all sorts of different drivers. So the message really is to monitor and model now, understand the areas to avoid it, and then start thinking about mitigation. What are the options in different areas? And that's good. The mitigation options, I didn't really go into any detail, but it's going to include not only where you are, so if you're close to the coast, you might have different options to if you're in the city, but also what sort of sediment you're on, because some are really highly permeable and some are really low permeability. So what options you put in different areas depends on that as well.
So overseas, wouldn't they be using a lot of trees and particularly like that can take up this shallow groundwater? I've not heard of people deliberately planting for that, but things like willows do live well in that sort of environment, and they do take up a lot of water. So it would seem to make sense to be using options like that.
Okay, a question which has fascinated me, and I'd be interested to know your answer. Before the earthquakes, what is now the red zone had houses on it, and I'm just thinking of Breezes Road. There was no flooding there, pretty much.
Right.
The earthquakes happened, they moved the houses, you've had liquefaction happening, and now, and I've observed this in a number of places, it rains, the water doesn't go away, it just sits on the surface. Now, talking to some people at council, they say, oh, it's groundwater. There's an experiment I want to do. I think that the liquefaction has formed an impermeable layer, and if we can take a core down, if we find wet and then dry underneath, I don't know. Have you got any information on this?
I've not heard of liquefaction forming an impermeable layer like that, but it's a possibility, and it would really be interesting. I've been talking to someone fairly recently about. It was a geotechnical hole that one of the geotechnical companies put down in the north of Christchurch, and they punctured the aquitard, the confining layer, and then water came pouring out from the underlying gravels, and they couldn't stop it. so you just have to be a little bit careful about things like that. Mind you, if you're in the red zone, it probably doesn't matter. The other possibility is that the land sunk. I mean, we did get land movement of a considerable amount post-earthquake. So maybe it's just that it didn't flood before because you had 0.5 metre of unsaturated zone, and now you've lost that 0.5 metre, so groundwater is just that bit closer to the surface. I'm not sure. It could be that either. It could be either. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, that's a really interesting point that Simon made, because over in Bexley, when it gets flooded, it just sits there for a long time. Until they turn the pumps on and it starts to drain out. One of the things that we've got happening down here with the North Beach stormwater system all comes out of the drains into the river by New Brighton Road, of course the Avon, and as the tide comes in, the tide comes up the pipes and it starts to flood all over the roads. Like we looked at maybe backflow solutions to actually try and do some sort of system that could avoid that happening. Is that possible?
Well, it's effectively what they did on the Heathcote and the Thames, for that matter. You put a tidal barrage in, but that's not usually very cheap.
Let the water come out, but not the water go up. Because the water coming up is actually causing a lot of the flooding all over the road and then into the red zone. It's not so much the water coming out of the ground straight away, it's the water coming up the pipes and causing a lot of it.
Simple thing would be put gate valves in
Yeah.
them all.
If it's a pipe, a valve would be okay.
When there's king tide.
We had those in summer, 3 of them, and they just have these rubber sort of scuppers that open with
Is that
gravity, and then they close when the,
But
but they're all broken. They're all broken. So the diggers come every time it's gonna rain, these guys on these 2 tons, and they just dig out this, it's just so, I mean, I'm sure there's.
We've got the same problem in South Shore,
Yeah.
and they unfortunately fitted the sort of the jobs that they, instead of putting them at 45 degrees, they put them at 90, so they half fill up with sediment. So they have to waste money clearing them.
Yeah.
But
So
let's not. This is not a bashing thing.
Groundwater topic here. So I actually have a question on groundwater topic. So you settled on 0.35 as a problem.
Yeah.
So what are the problems over that, and what areas of the city are affected after half a metre of sea level rise and a metre of sea level rise? Which ones have their groundwater greater than 0.35?
I'd have to go back and look at the maps. Like I said, there's the areas that currently are mapped to have high groundwater levels stick out like a sore thumb, and then the effects of sea level rise tend to be relatively small compared to that. I mean, if you look in detail, you can see how the effects propagate, but your eye gets drawn to these areas that are already red. But if you look in detail, you can see how they grow and how the groundwater levels close to the coast come up and things like that. But off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you which areas specifically are affected. I know part of the Brighton Spit is want to get to the higher sea level rise scenarios. And from memory, a lot of it's around the rivers as well. So.
And above the second part of the question is above that 0.35, what becomes difficult?
Oh, that's. I mean, it's everything. Roading is the key one. Services are another. Even down to like all those things that I talked about, planting trees, you'll find your trees start to die, and in some cases can fall over because the roots can't actually form a good base. You can, if you've got basements, the 0.35 is actually it's not deep enough. You're just getting more and more of a problem with basements. There's all sorts of problems that arise from that. But the 0.35, like I said, was a figure that was a compromise. So don't forget, it's a point, when we mapped it, it's the 0.35 below ground level, but that's occurring only 15% of the time or more. So it's not that you've always got groundwater levels at that level, it's just that you can expect that over a year that 15% of the time you might expect to have groundwater levels shallower than that. So there's no easy answer to that. There's all sorts of things that 0.35 or at 85th percentile 0.35 level could affect, but it was trying to fit a compromise between what's already built in the built environment, how people are coping with it, how the council are coping with it in terms of infiltration. So, yeah, there's no easy answer. Something.
At 0.7, there's a lot of areas now at 0.7, and we're living quite happily.
Yes, yeah, and that was the thinking actually. Yeah, there are lots of areas where people are quite happy to live with that. And one of the questions that came up was really, we could use 0.35 as our sort of standard for areas that are already developed, but do we want to set a different standard for areas where you might be wanting to put a subdivision in? And again, we'd sort of talked about it, and it was that sort of thing's probably going to be addressed more on a case-by-case basis in terms of sort of subdivisions. But yeah, it's a very complicated question to answer. Yeah.
Back over to Simon.
I don't want to ask only one more question, and it's a curiosity, and I think the answer's in the data, because I did read your report and spent time on it. If you take a tidal cycle, so you've got about 2 cycles a day,
Yeah.
2 high tides a day and 2 low tides a day. The driving force, if you've got groundwater and sea level going up and down, there's going to be a transmission coefficient because the high tide height is only there for a couple of hours.
Yeah.
Does your data actually show that tidal? So I'm curious
Tidal
about
it's
the
tidal
transmission.
efficiency.
It's distance from the shore that
Yeah.
will affect it, I understand.
I didn't mention that really, but we did do some work looking at tidal efficiency and how far those effects propagate. But absolute maximum a kilometre in most areas. But we also looked at it in a bit more detail separately to this. And there are some areas where the tidal response actually propagates further. So Kerr's Reach is one of those for some reason. You get the tidal response going a lot further inland there than you do in parts of the further down the Avon. So, but it's complicated because the further you go up the river, the smaller. Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, but I mean it is complicated by the fact that that tidal response depends on your distance from the river. It depends on the sediment type. It also depends on the actual signal you get in the river. So as you move further up, the signal is actually getting smaller as well. So there's all these things working together. Yeah.
Does it sort of slow down at Kerr's Reach?
Does it slow down the tidal
response
in the river? Or?
Yeah.
No, there's still quite a tidal response there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just noticed when I used to paddle on there quite a lot, it was actually quite a strong current all the way to Kerr's Reach, and then when you turn the corner, it slowed down. And
Yeah. Oh, I see. So you're sort of getting to that stagnation point almost in terms of it goes up. The tidal response goes up higher than Kerr's Reach. Yeah. I think it's up there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, the existing infrastructure that we've got now, is that able to cope with more groundwater rise?
You'd have to ask the council engineers, but but given that they're already trying to get rid of groundwater out of things like the sewers, then it's obviously a big concern for them.
I guess it's a matter of response, though, isn't it? For example, South Shore has the sewer system, that's the pump system. So that's the response to allow that to be successful in that situation. And maybe subdivisions may have a different response to that kind of infrastructure based on that. Would that be correct?
Yeah. But like I say, it's not always as simple as just sealing up sewers, because if you happen to seal up a sewer that and put pressure sewer in much higher up, you've solved your problem of getting all that water in the sewer, but you then potentially created a groundwater flooding problem because
I'm thinking about like the underground electrical cables and everything too.
That's another area of council that are concerned about it. Yeah.
Just a curious question, not a question, a thought. So if 2/3 of the water going through Bromley are groundwater,
it's 1/3 is groundwater.
1/3.
Yeah.
Then the cost of that. I know you can't do anything about it because the sewers are permeable, but the cost is that's a third. Good grief, it's a big number. Sorry. Just thinking.
But the flip side is it's actually performing a service of getting rid of groundwater.
Yes.
So it's actually quite a good idea to drill holes in that.
Okay.
Because it's not going out, it's coming in, right?
So there is a cost, and that's why the council have been trying to improve the sewer network. Years ago they reckon they got it back to pre-earthquake levels. The earthquakes just stuffed it, but they reckon they got it back to pre-earthquake maintenance sort of levels probably 4 or 5 years ago. But obviously they're always trying to improve it to reduce the cost of treating all that. But
I wonder how much they eliminated it, how much would groundwater rise?
Yeah, that's the worry, isn't it? You could do some back of the envelope calculations to work out sort of the effects in different areas. Yeah.
Estimate the volume of groundwater you're losing, and then what that would be as a
Yeah, you
fluxing.
could just add it across the city, but then that's not quite right, because it'll depend where you seal up sewers and everything else. It's
Lack of evidence,
yeah,
I think,
yeah.
Anybody else? So, I would like to thank Helen very much and Aqualinc. Anything as you like.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.